November 1944. Somewhere along the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The machine gun had been firing for 11 minutes straight, not in bursts. Not tactically. The MG-42 crew knew they owned this tree line. Every third tracer round cut through the fog like a red thread stitching the earth to the sky. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a statement, a declaration that this hillside belonged to them, and anyone who disagreed would be folded into the mud with the others. Private First Class Daniel Kovac crouched behind a shattered oak stump, breath fogging in the freezing air. His rifle lay beside him, useless. The German position was dug in 200 yards upslope. Reinforced logs, sandbags, interlocking fire lanes. Standard doctrine said you called in artillery, but the radios were dead. The mortars were 3 miles back with a supply column that hadn't moved in 2 days. So Kovac knelt in the frost with a broken 60mm mortar tube, 4 empty ration tins, a coil of commo wire, and a fistful of blasting caps scavenged from a satchel charge that had misfired 2 nights ago. Behind him, Sergeant Dalton watched in silence, then muttered to the man beside him, "He's lost his goddamn mind." The weapon that would silence the nest hadn't been issued by any quartermaster. The Hürtgen Forest in November 1944 was not a battlefield. It was a killing floor dressed in pine and fog. By the time Kovac's unit, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Division, pushed into the German border woodlands, the forest had already consumed 3 American divisions. Not defeated them, consumed them. Men walked in as companies and came out as squads. Entire platoons vanished into the timber, swallowed by artillery tree bursts, machine gun ambushes, and mines buried under frozen leaves that crunched louder than footsteps. The trees were too dense for air support. The canopy turned daylight into permanent dusk. Radio signals fractured against the terrain. Supply trucks bogged down on logging roads turned to frozen slurry. Doctrine said you advanced with combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, air coordination. But the Hürtgen stripped all of that away. It forced you back to 1918. Back to men with rifles, crawling through mud, dying for 100 yards of worthless ground. And the Germans knew it. They had spent months fortifying every ridgeline, every draw, every crossroads. Concrete bunkers, log-reinforced machine gun nests, teller mines and shoe mines scattered like seeds. They didn't need to counterattack. They just had to wait. Let the Americans come uphill. Let the forest do the rest. Kovac's company had been at 70% strength when they entered the forest 5 days ago. Now they were at 38%. Not from a single catastrophic engagement, just steady erosion. A man stepping on a mine, a sniper round through the neck, a tree burst shredding 3 soldiers who'd huddled together for warmth. Death arrived without drama, just cold mathematics. The machine gun nest on Hill 232 had pinned them for 2 days. It wasn't a strategic position. It didn't guard a road junction or a supply depot. It was just a hill, but it controlled the only route forward that didn't funnel them into a pre-sighted kill zone. Command wanted the hill cleared by nightfall. They didn't say how. They didn't send reinforcements. They just repeated the order every 6 hours, like a mantra that might manifest reality through repetition. The battalion's 81mm mortar platoon was 3 miles to the rear, consolidated with another unit after losing half its crews to counter-battery fire. The forward observer had been killed on day 2. His radio was smashed. The backup radio's battery had died in the cold. There was no artillery, no air support, no tanks that could navigate the logging trails without throwing a track. Just infantry, and the Germans waiting uphill. Kovac had joined the unit 6 weeks ago as a replacement. He'd been a machinist before the war, worked in a Cleveland factory that made engine parts for Ford. He understood tolerances, pressures, improvisation when a lathe broke down mid-shift. The other men didn't know this. They just knew he was quiet, competent, and hadn't gotten anyone killed yet. When the mortar tube arrived, dragged forward by a supply runner who'd somehow survived the gauntlet, it came without a base plate. The runner said it had been blown off by a near miss. The sight was cracked. The bipod bent. Kovac took it anyway, sat with it in a foxhole while the MG-42 hammered the ridgeline above them, turned it over in his hands like a broken prayer. Sergeant Dalton found him there at dawn. "That thing's scrap." Kovac didn't look up. "Maybe. You planning to fix it with good intentions?" "Planning to make it work." Dalton stared at him. The sergeant was 24 but looked 40. His eyes had the flat, exhausted quality of a man who'd stopped expecting miracles 3 months ago. "We've got no base plate. No sight. No proper rounds." "I know. So what exactly are you going to shoot out of it?" "Prayers." Kovac finally met his eyes. "I'll figure something out." Dalton walked away, shaking his head. Context, strategic background, Part 2. The problem wasn't just the broken mortar. It was the entire logistical spine of the American war machine failing under the weight of autumn mud and German stubbornness. By November 1944, the U.S. Army was fighting on a supply line stretched from Normandy to the German border. Over 400 miles of shattered French roads, blown bridges and rail lines the retreating Wehrmacht had methodically destroyed. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every replacement boot had to be trucked forward through a transportation network held together with spit and desperation. The famous Red Ball Express, the convoy system that had kept Patton's tanks moving in August, was hemorrhaging trucks faster than depots could replace them. Drivers pushed vehicles until axles snapped. Tires were bald, engines seized. The quartermasters performed miracles daily, but miracles have limits, and the Hürtgen ate supplies like a furnace. Artillery shells vanished into the canopy, detonating in treetops and showering men with wooden shrapnel that X-rays couldn't detect. Tanks threw tracks on the steep root-choked trails. Radios died in the wet cold. Rifle bolts froze. Mortar base plates sank into the mud and had to be dug out by hand. Medical supplies ran low because casualty rates exceeded projections. Projections based on open-field combat, not this claustrophobic nightmare of close-range ambushes where men died 10 feet from each other and never saw the shooter. For Kovács's battalion, resupply came every 72 hours if the weather cooperated, if the trucks didn't get lost, if the road wasn't mined. The last delivery had brought ammunition, rations, and mail. No mortar rounds, no replacement base plates, no radio batteries. When Kovács asked the supply sergeant about 60mm shells, the man laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. "Son, I got 3 companies screaming for bandages, 2 platoons out of rifle ammo, and a colonel who wants me to conjure up a tank battalion from thin air. You want mortar rounds? Go ask the Germans. They got plenty." So Kovács stopped asking. He sat in his foxhole and studied the problem like an engine that wouldn't turn over. You identified the failure point. You found a workaround. You used what you had, what he had, a mortar tube with no base plate, no sight, and no ammunition. What he needed, a way to loft explosives 200 yards uphill into a fortified position. The physics were simple. Angle, propellant, projectile mass. He'd watched mortar crews work before. Drop the round down the tube. Let the firing pin strike the primer. Let the gases expand and throw the shell skyward in a clean parabolic arc. Textbook ballistics, but without a base plate, the tube had nothing to brace against. The recoil would drive it backward into the mud, or worse, into his chest. Without a sight, he was guessing elevation by eyeball. And without proper rounds, he had nothing to shoot, except he did. The supply crates came packed in metal tins. Ration cans, solid steel, cylindrical, open at one end. They fit inside the mortar tube with maybe an 1/8-inch clearance. And scattered around the company's positions were the remnants of a satchel charge that had failed to detonate 3 nights ago. Blasting caps. Prima cord. A brick of composition C2 that nobody wanted to handle because it had been frozen, thawed, and frozen again. Kovács gathered them quietly. Didn't announce what he was doing. Just collected the materials like a man preparing to fix a carburetor, not build a weapon. He nested the blasting caps inside a ration tin. Packed the space with C2, molded carefully to avoid air pockets. Wrapped the whole assembly with commo wire to keep it together during flight. Then he carved wooden wedges from a shattered rifle stock to jam inside the tube as a makeshift sabot. Something to grip the tin. Transfer the propellant force and let the projectile separate cleanly once it left the barrel. It wasn't a mortar round. It was a pipe bomb with a trajectory. The other men watched him work in silence. Nobody helped. Nobody stopped him either. There was a tacit understanding that Kovács had crossed into territory beyond standard procedure, and whatever happened next would either vindicate him or kill him. And either way, they'd rather not be complicit. Private Lemieux, a replacement from Boston, finally spoke up. "That thing's gonna blow your hands off." Kovács didn't look up. "Maybe. You even know how much propellant to use? I'll figure it out." Jesus Christ. Lemieux turned to Sergeant Dalton. "Sarge, you're really gonna let him do this?" Dalton stared at the ridgeline. The MG-42 was silent now, but everyone knew it was still there. Waiting. Watching, daring them to move. "You got a better idea?" Dalton said quietly. Lemieux opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Kovács kneeling in the mud with his Frankenstein mortar, and said nothing. Kovács hadn't slept more than 90 minutes at a time in 4 days. Not because of discipline. Not because of watch rotations. Because every time he closed his eyes, the forest replayed the same loop. The sound of Corporal Hendricks stepping on a shoe mine and screaming for 11 seconds before his lungs collapsed. The wet thump of a tree burst dropping private oaks into the mud with his spine shattered. The smell of gangrene from a man 3 foxholes over who'd taken shrapnel in the thigh and couldn't be evacuated because the aid station was pinned down just like everyone else. Sleep became a liability. A place where memory ambushed you harder than the Germans. So he worked instead. Kept his hands busy. Kept his mind on angles, measurements, the small solvable problems that didn't involve wondering whether the next step would detonate the ground beneath your boot. The other men coped differently. Lemieux chain-smoked cigarettes that he rationed like sacraments, 1 every 4 hours, timed precisely, because once they were gone, there wouldn't be more. Dalton wrote letters he never sent, filling pages with neat handwriting that said nothing about where he was or what he'd seen, just bland observations about weather and missing home. Another private, whose name Kovacs had never learned, sat in his foxhole and whispered the rosary in Polish until his lips cracked and bled from the cold. Fear was a constant. But it wasn't the sharp adrenaline fear of combat. It was duller, heavier. The fear of attrition, of being slowly deleted from the world by impersonal mathematics, probability and trajectory, and the cold fact that no matter how careful you were, the forest had more ways to kill you than you had ways to survive it. Kovacs understood machines. He understood that parts wore out, tolerances degraded. Systems failed not from single catastrophic errors, but from accumulated stress over time. And he understood, in a way he couldn't articulate, that men were no different. He saw it in Dalton's eyes. The flatness, the exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. The sergeant still gave orders, still kept the men organized, but something essential had been ground down. Not courage, something older. The belief that competence mattered, that doing things right would keep you alive. The forest taught a different lesson. Competence bought you nothing. The best rifleman in the company had died first, shot through the forehead by a sniper he never saw. The most cautious man, the one who triple-checked every step, had triggered a mine anyway because the Germans had started daisy-chaining them with pressure releases that detonated when you lifted your foot. Not when you set it down. Survival was random. Effort was irrelevant, except Kovacs couldn't accept that. Wouldn't. Because if survival was random, then there was no point to the mortar tube in his hands. No point to the careful measurements, the jerry-rigged baseplate he was building from sandbags and a scavenged ammo crate. No point to any of it. So he worked. Because working was the only prayer he had left. Angle 2. Mechanical, engineering reality. The physics of what Kovacs was attempting should have been impossible. A standard 60mm mortar round weighed just over 3 pounds and contained a precisely measured propellant charge, designed to generate consistent muzzle velocity. The baseplate absorbed recoil and kept the tube stable. The sight allowed for elevation adjustments calculated to the degree. Everything was engineered for repeatability. Fire 10 rounds at the same settings, get 10 rounds in the same target area. What Kovacs had built was none of that. His projectile, the ration tin packed with C2 and blasting caps, weighed maybe 2 pounds, unevenly distributed, with a center of gravity that shifted depending on how the explosive settled. The propellant charge was a guess. Too little, and the round would arc weakly and land short. Too much, and the tube would rupture, or the tin would disintegrate mid-flight and scatter shrapnel in every direction, including his. The baseplate was 4 sandbags stacked and lashed together with the bottom of an ammunition crate wedged underneath. It would absorb some recoil. Maybe. Or it would collapse sideways and send the tube tumbling. No way to know until he fired it. Elevation was calculated by eye. Kovacs had watched mortar crews work, knew that a 45-degree angle gave you maximum range, knew that steeper meant shorter distance, shallower meant flatter trajectory. He jammed the tube into the sandbag assembly at what felt like 50 degrees, then adjusted it slightly lower. The German position was uphill. He needed to compensate for gravity, for the climbing arc. But the real problem was the tube itself. Without a proper base plate, the tube would try to walk backward with each shot. Infantry mortars were designed to be braced against the ground, the recoil absorbed through mass and friction. Kovacs had neither. His base plate weighed maybe 30 pounds. The recoil force from a standard mortar round was over 2,000 pounds of instantaneous pressure. The numbers didn't work, so he changed the numbers. He reduced the propellant charge. Instead of a full increment bag, he tore it open and removed half the powder. Less propellant meant less recoil, but also less range. He'd have to compensate with a steeper angle, which meant a higher arc, which meant less accuracy. He was trading precision for survival, building a weapon that might work once, maybe twice, before the whole assembly shook itself apart. And even if it worked, even if the round flew true and landed on target, there was no guarantee the improvised explosive would detonate on impact. Blasting caps weren't fuses. They required a shock to trigger. If the tin hit soft ground, it might bury itself and do nothing. If it hit at the wrong angle, the caps might fail. Kovacs knew all of this, understood the odds, and kept working anyway, because the alternative was waiting for resupply that wasn't coming, waiting for orders that would send them uphill into the machine gun's teeth, waiting to die like Hendricks, like Oakes, like the others whose names were already fading from memory. He tightened the commo wire around the tin, checked the wedges inside the tube, ran his thumb along the mortar's scarred metal surface, feeling for cracks, weak points, anything that might fail under pressure. The weapon was a prayer built from scrap and desperation, but it was still a weapon. No. 3. Leadership Doctrine Sergeant. Dalton had been trained to fight by the manual. Fort Benning, 1943. 12 weeks of instruction that hammered doctrine into your skull until it became reflex. Infantry advances with fire support. You don't assault a fortified position without artillery prep. You don't improvise weapons in the field because improvisation gets men killed. You follow the chain of command. You trust the system. The Hürtgen had shattered all of that. Dalton still gave orders, still maintained discipline, but inside, where the other men couldn't see, he was drowning. The manual had no chapter for this. No section on what to do when your radios are dead. Your mortars are gone. Your supply line is a joke. And division keeps sending orders as if you still had a functional company instead of 38 exhausted men clinging to frozen mud. When Kovacs started building his contraption, Dalton's first instinct was to stop him. Confiscate the materials, cite regulations about unauthorized modification of ordnance, remind him that field-expedient explosives violated about 6 different articles of military law. But he didn't, because Dalton had run out of alternatives 3 days ago. He'd requested artillery support, denied. Asked for air reconnaissance, denied. Requested permission to bypass Hill 232 and find another route, denied. Battalion wanted the hill. Didn't matter that it was a tactical dead end. Didn't matter that taking it would cost half his remaining men. Orders were orders. So Dalton made a choice that would have gotten him court-martialed in peacetime. He let Kovacs work. Didn't endorse it. Didn't help. Just allowed it to happen. Plausible deniability wrapped in exhaustion. If it worked, he'd claim he'd authorized a field-expedient solution under combat necessity. If it failed and killed Kovacs, he'd say the private had acted without permission. Leadership in the Hürtgen had become the art of managed catastrophe. You didn't make good decisions. You made the least bad decision available and prayed it wouldn't cost more lives than it saved. Dalton watched Kovacs kneel in the mud, adjusting the tube's angle with the care of a watchmaker, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the loud, confident hope of August when they'd thought the war might be over by Christmas. Something quieter, darker. The hope of a drowning man who sees a piece of driftwood and knows it probably won't save him, but grabs it anyway. Because what else is there to do? Think it'll work? Lemieux asked quietly. Dalton kept his eyes on the ridgeline. No idea. You gonna stop him? You volunteering to walk up that hill instead? Lemieux, shut up. Angle 4. Enemy perspective Obergefreiter Klaus Weber had been manning the MG-42 nest on Hill 232 for 6 days. He was 20 years old. Drafted in 1943. Trained in defensive doctrine that emphasized prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire, and the principle that a well-sighted machine gun was worth a company of riflemen. His instructors had been right. The Americans kept trying to advance, and the MG-42 kept cutting them down. Weber didn't feel anything about it anymore. Not pride, not guilt. Just the mechanical rhythm of combat. Watch the tree line, identify movement, traverse the gun, squeeze the trigger, watch the tracers stitch the fog. Reload. Repeat. The gun itself was a masterpiece. 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast the sound blurred into a single tearing scream. The Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw. Weber just called it his best friend. It didn't freeze, didn't jam, didn't question orders. Feed it belts and keep the barrel cool, and it would run forever. His position was textbook, reinforced with logs and sandbags, cut into the slope so the gun fired slightly downhill. Maximum field of view, minimum exposure, ammunition stored in waterproof cans, spare barrels wrapped in canvas, escape route mapped to a secondary position 20 meters back. Weber's spotter, Schütze Baumann, was 43, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd been wounded at Kursk and sent west to recover by manning static defenses. Baumann didn't talk much. Just smoked cigarettes down to the filter and scanned the American lines with binoculars that had once belonged to a Soviet officer. They're not moving, Baumann said, exhaling smoke. They will. Not today. Tomorrow, then. Baumann shrugged. Tomorrow we'll kill them tomorrow. Weber adjusted the gun's traverse. The Americans were pinned in a draw 200 meters downslope. No cover, no concealment. Every time they tried to flank, the gun swung and drove them back. Simple geometry. Simple doctrine. He'd stopped thinking of them as men. They were targets, movement patterns, tactical problems to be solved with a machine gun's geometry. What did Tornatone Weber couldn't see from his elevated position, was the lone American soldier kneeling in the mud with a broken mortar tube and a desperate plan. Angle. Fee. 5-5. Logistical perspective, Captain Raymond Hitch, battalion supply officer, sat in a requisition tent 3 miles behind the line and stared at paperwork that made no sense. On paper, 2nd Battalion had 60% of its authorized equipment. Radios, mortars, medical supplies, ammunition. The numbers said they were combat effective. The reality was different. Half the radios were non-functional, batteries dead, circuits corroded by moisture. The mortars were scattered across 3 separate positions with no centralized fire control. Medical supplies were hemorrhaging faster than replacements arrived because nobody at division believed the casualty rates. And ammunition was being expended at 3 times the projected rate because tree bursts meant you had to fire twice as many shells to achieve the same effect as open ground. Combat. Hitch had tried explaining this to division, submitted reports with detailed breakdowns of actual versus authorized equipment, requested emergency resupply convoys, got back form letters about maintaining supply discipline and prioritizing critical shortages. The disconnect was philosophical. Division planned logistics for a mobile war, breakthrough, exploitation, pursuit. The Hürtgen was static, grinding. It consumed resources the way a furnace consumed coal, steadily, remorselessly, without visible progress. When the request came through for mortar base plates and 60mm rounds, Hitch checked his inventory sheets and laughed. Not cruelty, just recognition of absurdity. He had 3 base plates in stock. One was cracked. One was allocated to another battalion. The third was sitting on a truck that had broken down 40 miles back and wouldn't be repaired for another week. So he stamped the request pending and filed it with the others, knowing it wouldn't matter, knowing the men on the line would find another way, or die trying. That was the real lesson of the Hürtgen. Doctrine assumed logistics worked, but logistics was just another form of optimism, and optimism died fast in the forest. Angle 6. Moral tension. Father Michael Brennan, battalion chaplain, walked the line at dusk and saw what war had done to men's faces. Not the physical damage. The internal erosion. The way their eyes tracked movement like animals in cages. The way they startled at sounds that weren't gunfire. The way they spoke in clipped sentences, as if language itself had become too heavy to carry. He'd offered communion that morning. 3 men showed up. One of them cried silently through the entire service. Another asked if God could forgive him for things he hadn't done yet, but knew he would. The third just stared at the makeshift altar and said nothing. When Brennan heard about Kovach's improvised mortar, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not horror, but recognition. This was what desperation looked like. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a machinist from Cleveland kneeling in frozen mud, building a weapon from trash because the alternatives were worse. Brennan didn't know what to pray for anymore. Victory seemed abstract. Survival seemed selfish. So he prayed for clarity, for the men to see some meaning in the grinding horror, for the war to end before it consumed every last piece of humanity in this forest. But mostly, he prayed that Kovach's weapon would work, because if it didn't, they'd try something else just as desperate. And eventually, desperation would hollow them out completely, until they were no different from the machines they operated, functional, obedient, and utterly empty inside. Climax, Turning Point, Part 11, 340 hours. November 18th, 1944, Kovach positioned the mortar tube at 48 degrees, wedged into the sandbag assembly like a broken limb set in a makeshift splint. The fog had thinned slightly, not enough to give the German gunners a clear view downslope, but enough that Kovach could see the dark line of their position, the shadow of reinforced logs, the disturbed earth where they'd dug in. 220 yards, maybe 230. Hard to judge distance through fog and uphill terrain. Behind him, 8 men had gathered, not helping, just watching, the way soldiers watched anything that broke the monotony of waiting to die. Lemieux was closest, cigarette dead between his lips. Dalton stood further back, arms crossed, face unreadable. Private Ostrowski, the Polish kid who prayed constantly, had his rosary wrapped around his fist so tight his knuckles were white. Nobody spoke. Kovach lifted the improvised round, the ration tin wrapped in commo wire. packed with C2 and blasting caps, and felt its weight. 2 pounds, maybe less. The primer charge was taped to the base, a salvaged firing cap from a rifle grenade that he'd carefully pressed into a hole drilled through the tin's bottom with a bayonet tip. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from cold. His fingers were numb, clumsy. He flexed them twice, blew on them, tried to restore sensation. Dropping the round now would kill everyone in a 15-foot radius. He looked up at the ridgeline. The MG-42 nest was silent, waiting. They knew the Americans were down here, knew they were pinned, probably thought they'd broken them psychologically, that the men in the draw would sit and rot until command pulled them back or sent them forward to die. Kovacs thought about Hendricks, the way his leg had come off at the knee when the mine went up, the 11 seconds of screaming that had felt like 11 hours. He thought about the supplies sergeant's laugh, the way division kept sending orders like everything was fine, like they had mortars and radios and artillery support and weren't just meat being fed into a forest that didn't care. He thought about his father's machine shop in Cleveland, the smell of cutting oil, the sound of lathes spinning, the way his father had taught him that every problem was just a puzzle, and every puzzle had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. He lowered the round into the tube. It stuck halfway. His heart stopped. The wooden wedges, the makeshift sabot he'd carved to grip the tin and transfer the propellant force, had swollen in the moisture. The tin wouldn't drop. It just hung there, lodged in the tube, 12 inches from the firing pin. Behind him, someone exhaled slowly, a sound like a prayer dying. Kovacs grabbed the tube with both hands and tilted it vertical, shook it gently. The round shifted an inch. Stuck again! He could feel the men's eyes on his back, could feel Dalton's exhaustion, Lemieux's doubt, the collective held breath of soldiers who'd just watched their last hope jam in a broken pipe. He tilted the tube further, 45 degrees, horizontal, shook, harder. The round slid free and dropped. The C-cone firing pin struck the primer with a sound like a hammer hitting a nail. The propellant ignited. Kovacs had calculated for recoil, had braced the tube against the sandbag assembly, positioned himself